the relation with the source. That's what the Vedas are. And there's different divisions. Without going through all of that, there's many divisions. And one of the sections of the Vedas is a philosophical section called the Upanishads. And then there's another very, very large section that's describing rituals that one can do to fulfill needs, human needs. It's called Karma Kanda. Section of the Vedas deals with, I have this desire, here's the way I can fulfill this desire or need, here's that desire, etc., etc. The philosophical portion behind that is called the Upanishads, or Jnana Kanda section. And then there's an historical section. The historical section is a way of taking the teachings and the rituals and giving them, explaining them, illustrating them, embedding them within historical narrations. So the history helps you understand what a thing is. Just like a little example. Supposing there's a portion of the Vedas that tells what ideal family life is. So you can read about it, but then if you see it, oh, that's what it is, etc. So there's historical narrations that are describing, illustrating, in picture form, the teachings, the philosophical portion of the Vedas. And in that historical section, there's what's called the ripened fruit, because the Vedas are sometimes compared to a desire tree. There are Sanskrit terms for that. Kalpa, vriksha. Vriksha means tree. Kalpa means desire. So most trees, they produce one kind of fruit during a particular season. And then the season's over and it doesn't produce fruit anymore till the next season. But the desire tree produces any kind of fruit at any season of any kind. And then the ripened fruit of that desire tree, called the Vedas, is the purpose of life. Because the Vedas are meant to help one achieve, restore the original purpose of life. And the fullness of the ripened stage of that is presented in Srimad-Bhagavatam. So it's a very special literature, very much revered amongst those who have understanding of the Vedas and access to the Vedas. And Srila Prabhupada, who's the drawing of him is here, went through a lot of effort to make the translation in readable English, along with purports that are a pablamized version of the previous acharyas, the great teachers, and their writings to explain the Srimad-Bhagavatam through the centuries, and he's taken those Sanskrit writings, given the essence, and presented it in his purports. So that's what's on the table over here, is Srimad-Bhagavatam with the Bhaktivedanta purports. And here's a little writing from Srimad-Bhagavatam that Prabhupada wrote. I'm just going to read. It's on the screen. Srimad-Bhagavatam is certainly a very dear scripture for all the devotees of the Lord, but it is auspicious even for the non-devotees also, because it explains that even the non-devotees, hovering under the spell of the material energy, can be delivered from such clutches if they hear the narration of Srimad-Bhagavatam with devotion and attention from the right source, representing the Lord by disciplic succession. So unpack that a little bit. of big importance is the disciplic succession, because the same understanding is throughout the Vedas. It's very strongly presented in Bhagavad Gita, the importance of disciplic succession, receiving knowledge in descending as opposed to an ascending fashion, hearing in a descending fashion from the right source. That's the right source. The right source is the source himself, Krishna, or one who has heard from Krishna, one has heard from one who has heard from Krishna, or one who has heard from one who has heard from one who has heard from Krishna, without any distortion. So the responsibility of those in disciplic succession is hear properly and don't change anything. Transmit what you've heard transparently, without editing and modifying and deleting and so forth. Just transparently presenting. That's disciplic succession. So one who has heard from such a source with devotion and attention. So attention is important. Attention is important. If you're driving, you have a nice machine, but you're not attentive, it can be pretty dangerous if you're driving without attention. And something that's very powerful, like the Vedas, if you're contacting it but you're not attentive, you can make a mess. So with attention and with devotion, and devotion means, in very simple language, with humility, I wish to understand. That's all. Very simple. I wish to understand. And that precludes thinking that you've already understood. Because if you think you've already understood something, you're not going to understand what's being presented. It's going to bounce. So, humility with an eagerness to understand. And then once you've understood, to at least apply it. At least try to apply it, to live by it. That's devotion. So with attention and devotion from the right source, then the spell of the material energy can be poof, dissipated, and completely gone. There's such potency in the Srimad-Bhagavatam. It's such a literature. That's what's being said here. Now, there's a total of 31 slides. So this is slide number 1. Prabhupada's spiritual master is pictured here, Bhaktisiddhanta. And he has a nice little saying that's titled, "No Other Book." So Bhaktisiddhanta wrote, even if all the books of the world were to be burned, there would be no harm, provided one treatise was left, Srimad-Bhagavatam. Even if thousands of learning centers were to be abolished, there would be no feeling of inconvenience, provided the reading and teaching of Srimad-Bhagavatam continued. And there are no other books in the world like Srimad-Bhagavatam. This is not mere tittle-tattle or an exaggerated homage. If one reflects on it as a truly impartial judge, one will realize that there has not been nor will there ever be a book like the Bhagavatam. So it's a luminary in the sky that's, in the language of the Bhagavatam, as brilliant as the sun. There's a passage in the Bhagavatam where some sages are asking a learned sage amongst them, when Krishna was present on earth, this comes right after Krishna's departure. When Krishna was present on the earth, just by the marks of his feet on the earth, everything was made auspicious. The earth was supplying in abundance, being very happy by the touch of Krishna's feet. All inauspiciousness was driven away, and now Krishna is gone. He's departed this world. So where will virtue and righteousness take shelter now? that Krishna is gone? And the answer, does not, it's a section later, it's a very explicit answer. It uses a metaphor, just like when the sun sets on the western horizon, darkness comes, but simultaneously on the eastern horizon comes the full moon. And when the full moon is as brilliant as the sun, that's like this appearance of Srimad-Bhagavatam, that gives everything that Krishna's presence gave to earth, but in the form of this literary presentation, as brilliant as the sun. It means the darkness of this age of Kali is dispelled by the light of the Srimad-Bhagavatam, and therefore there's a literature called the light of the Bhagavat. It gives light. It gives vision in an age of darkness of how to live your life in a way that's brilliant, despite a dark age. So it's a very special book, if heard in the proper manner. And Bhakti Siddhanta, whose image, this is his image, he naturally had a father, and his father is pictured here, and his father was also a great, great spiritual personality. He wrote 100 books. Try writing a book sometime. He wrote 100 books, and he was a very important person during this time. He was a high court judge during the height of the British rule, which never happened. They didn't have local people do that, because in that British system, or in the ancient system, a magistrate was next to the king. I mean, he didn't just have sitting on a bench kind of duties. He had enforcement duties. He was a powerful person, a powerful position, and the British government appointed him because he was so good, and they trusted him, and he was trusted by the people. So he was a good person for that service. So here's what he wrote. From Pranava, or Om, came Gayatri. Now, I think everybody here knows what Om is, at least conceptually. It's a sacred syllable. Within Om is everything. It's that original sound, Om. And the Sanskrit word is Pranava. So from that Om, or Pranava, came Gayatri. Gayatri is the mother of all mantras. Gayatri mantras, she's the mama, and from mama comes all the babies. All the other mantras come from Gayatri mantra, and Om is the source. And from Gayatri came the Vedas, from the Vedas came the Brahma Sutra, and from the Brahma Sutra came Srimad-Bhagavatam, which has brilliantly risen like a Satchit Ananda sun. Satchit Ananda means eternity, knowledge, and bliss. Satchit Ananda, giving light in this age of darkness. Those who have eyes should see, those who have ears should hear, and those who have minds should meditate on the topics of Srimad-Bhagavatam. And that's an introduction to one of his books. Now, moving up the line of disciplic succession, skipping a few generations, but here's a very important personality named Sanatana Goswami. Now, during the evening classes, what I've been doing while here in St. Louis is giving some historical perspectives on the Goswamis of Vrindavan. For those of you that are a little newer, Krishna appeared in Vrindavan, and the personality who is Krishna himself, who appeared in this age, Kali Yuga, to teach love of Krishna, is Lord Chaitanya. And Lord Chaitanya's teachings were invested in the 6 Goswamis who were told to write it. He didn't write, he just taught and lived. And then they were invested with the potency to write. So one of those 6 is Sanatana Goswami. So there's this nice story. When Sanatana Goswami was a young man, a brahmana, or priest, appeared to him in a dream and blissfully gave him Srimad-Bhagavatam. Now, during his time, there wasn't a printing press. So to receive a Bhagavatam was like, that's awesome. Because this is, readily available. But then it wasn't. It was handwritten on leaves and things like that. So it was in his dream, someone gave him, and he woke up. Then later that morning, the same brahmana came and gave him the Srimad-Bhagavatam. Jai. When he obtained the Bhagavatam, Sanatana became ecstatic and merged into the ocean of prema. After this incident took place, Sanatana began reading Srimad-Bhagavatam daily. Then here's a painting where he's meeting Lord Chaitanya. Later, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu gave personal instructions to Sanatana about the essence of Srimad-Bhagavatam. Based on those instructions, Sanatana compiled Darshani Tika, a commentary on Hari Bhakti Vilas, Vaishnava Toshani, and Brihad Bhagavatamrita. So those are Sanskrit names, and they're titles of books that are expanding and expounding on the meaning of the Bhagavatam. Vaishnava Toshani, for example, is a verse by verse by verse by verse commentary on all 18,000 verses of the Bhagavatam. That's one of his books. The last one on that list is a very unique literature. It's a commentary on the Bhagavatam that's a story within a story within a story. But it's helping the reader to understand the essence of Srimad-Bhagavatam. It's very fascinating, and someday you may want to read that one too. It's printed by the BBT with commentary by Sanatana Goswami, who made a commentary on his book, which is a commentary on the Bhagavatam. In other words, he's a lover of the Bhagavatam, and he's a knower of the Bhagavatam, and he made it available to us in different forms to help us enter into its message. There's a nice story that's found within the Vedic texts. The painting you see, there's some wives, because Krishna appeared in the capital, a city called Mathura. But the very evening that he appeared, because the king of Mathura was wicked, the parents had him transferred out of Mathura to another place nearby, Vrindavan. You've heard of Vrindavan. Everyone's heard of Vrindavan. So Krishna remained in Vrindavan for 12 years, and then by transcendental arrangement, he was brought to Mathura, where a 12-year-old boy with one punch finished Kamsa and his 5 wrestlers and the whole thing. And he freed Kamsa's father from prison. He freed his mother and father from prison, and he stayed in Mathura for some years, and then he went to Dwarka. So those are 3 residences: Vrindavan, Mathura, and Dwarka. When he was in Dwarka, with the Chinese devotees, we just went through twice now the details of his marriage to different queens. He had a lot of queens. Big number. And he built palaces for each of the queens. And he expanded himself into identical Krishnas to simultaneously exist with each of the queens. But by the agency of his spiritual potency, they didn't know that he was simultaneously with each of the queens. They thought she was his favorite because he was with them. But he was simultaneously with each of them. Pretty amazing. And then when the purpose of his appearance in this world was complete, he returned to the spiritual world. He left behind his queens. But there was a purpose in that, because his favorite place of all was Vrindavan, and they knew it. So they wanted to experience going to Vrindavan after his departure. So now we're going to hear some text. After Krishna's disappearance from this world, the queens came to Braja. Braja is Vrindavan, where Vajranabh, Krishna's grandson, was protecting them. So here's the detail. They're in Dwarka. Krishna informed his chariot driver before he departed, the city of Dwarka is going to sink underwater in 7 days. Please arrange for the queens and all the remaining residents to vacate because it's going to sink. And they should be very carefully escorted back to Mathura and put in the care of my grandson, Vajranabh. So they were escorted by Arjuna back to Mathura, and the capital now is in the care of Vajranabha. Actually, the capital was in the care of Janamejaya, and Janamejaya gave that service to Vajranabha. In any case, there he is. Vajranabha is looking after all the queens. One day, while being tormented by the pain of separation from Krishna, they noticed that one of the queens, named Kalindi, was very happy. And they asked, "How come you're so happy? We're so unhappy." And Kalindi said she had personal experience of how one of Krishna's very, very, very intimate friends and associates provided a remedy. And that remedy, the person's name was Uddhava, was that Uddhava had visited Vrindavan, and when Uddhava came back from Vrindavan, he was so filled with happiness about the love, the kind of love of the residents of Vrindavan, that he made all the rest of us happy. So they wanted to know, how are we going to find Uddhava? Because we want to become happy like you are. And she said, well, I was told that Uddhava, having such love and such affection and such appreciation for the residents of Vrindavan, he prayed to Krishna that he could become a blade of grass in Vrindavan and have the residents of Vrindavan place the dust from their feet on his grass head and be benedicted. So let's go to Vrindavan. So they brought the idea to Vajranabh, Krishna's grandson. And he said, let's go. And not only, he said, it was actually Maharaj Parikshit, not Vajranabha. So Maharaj Parikshit went together with the queens to go to Vrindavan. And when they were in Vrindavan, what did they do? They started singing Krishna's name in a big, big festival. And as they were singing Krishna's name in a big, big festival, all of a sudden, Uddhava appeared, emerging out of a grove of bushes and grass and creepers. And there's Uddhava. Wow, they're like, wow, that was really great. So as they continued the chanting, Uddhava offered his respects to the king, Maharaj Parikshit. Now, this is from the one scripture where this is described as Skanda Purana. There's a very similar description in Padma Purana, and they slightly vary a little bit what happens next. But from the Padma Purana, what happens next is Uddhava is going to give advice to the king how the queens can become satisfied. O king, you are most fortunate. You are always in exclusive devotion to Krishna. Among all the inhabitants of Dwarka, these queens are without a doubt most fortunate. Under the influence of Yogamaya, they have forgotten themselves and are suffering from anxiety caused by separation from Krishna. Unless Krishna becomes visible to them, none of them will regain their proper consciousness. But Krishna has wound up his pastimes. That time has finished, and now we have entered a different age. However, listen, and I will tell you another way. After Krishna departs, what's the other way? Hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam. So that's what they said, yeah, let's have all the queens gathered together, and I'd like to hear too, Uddhava, I'd like to hear you narrate Srimad-Bhagavatam. And so he did. And we'll see some illustrations. And by their hearing Uddhava describe Krishna within Srimad-Bhagavatam, their sorrow is gone, their joy returned, and one by one they attained the spiritual world. That's the narration in these two other Puranas, not the Srimad-Bhagavatam, but Skanda Purana and Padma Purana narrate they return to the spiritual world that way. How? Hearing Srimad-Bhagavatam from the proper source. The proper source in this case was Uddhava. So next, I'm going to share with you something I find very interesting, at least, and that is at different times, in different forms, Srimad-Bhagavatam has been presented. And here's some of them. Now, for the newer people, you don't know what these references are, but that's okay. You get the general picture. One reference is Skanda Purana, and in the Skanda Purana, Lord Krishna speaks Srimad-Bhagavatam to Lord Vishnu. Lord Vishnu is at the bottom here. From him are coming all these universes, and he's reclined in the causal ocean, and it was in the cloud of the material energy, and then beyond the cloud of the material energy is Krishna in the spiritual sky. So Krishna is narrating Srimad-Bhagavatam to Vishnu as narrated in Skanda Purana. Pretty far out, huh? And here's another. Lord Vishnu then narrates the same Srimad-Bhagavatam to Lakshmi, the goddess of fortune. And then also in the Skanda Purana, Lord Narayana, who is pictured here in Vaikuntha, he narrates Srimad-Bhagavatam to Lord Shiva. And in the Bhagavatam itself, we find Lord Narayana, or Lord Garbhodakshaya Vishnu can be named Lord Narayana. He narrates to Brahma. Brahma is the first born living being who is born of all places on a lotus flower, growing from the navel of Garbhodakshaya Vishnu, and stated in these texts of the Srimad-Bhagavatam, Vishnu, or Lord Narayana, narrates to Brahma by imparting within his heart. Brahma then teaches the same to Narada Muni. Narada Muni teaches the same to Vyasadeva. Vyasadeva writes Srimad-Bhagavatam in a written form because it's the age of Kali and people's memory is shorter. So he wrote it down. And then Vyasadeva, taught it to his son, Shukadeva. Shukadeva taught the same Srimad-Bhagavatam that we have on the table over here to the king, Maharaj Parikshit. And one of the persons in the audience there is Sutta. Sutta narrated the whole Srimad-Bhagavatam to all these thousands of sages assembled at a holy place called Naimisharanya. That's all of this you'll find within the Srimad-Bhagavatam. Then, in another circumstance, this is Maharaj Parikshit, who is dying, being bitten by a snake bird. Notice there's no such thing as a snake bird. It's a mystical entity. And the snake bird bites him, and instantly the venom is so intense, his body bursts into flames. But before that happened, Maharaj Parikshit, having heard Srimad Bhagavatam from Shukadev, when Bhagavatam was finished, then the mother of Maharaj Parikshit said, I couldn't understand everything. Could you explain it to me in a simpler form, please? And so he did. He narrated to his mother, Uttara, before the snake bird appeared. And that's what Brihat Bhagavatamrita is. I'm looking at our gentleman who likes to read. So, Brihat Bhagavatamrita is Maharaj Parikshit's summary to his mother, Uttara, what he heard. But it's in a simpler form, or not a verbatim form, but it's his realization. In Skanda Purana, here's this depiction where Uddhava, there's Uddhava, he looks like, his complexion is like Krishna, he dressed like Krishna, but he's not Krishna, he's Uddhava, and he's narrating Bhagavatam to all the queens in Dwarka. But the queens in Dwarka at this time, they're visiting Vrindavan, so that's where it took place, described in Skanda Purana. Here's another. Lord Shiva is narrating Bhagavatam to Parvati and Shukadev Goswami, because we find places within the Bhagavatam where Shukadev Goswami says he heard such and such narration from Lord Shiva. Interesting. And this little note here is there's some tradition. Some of you are from India. Whoops, what happened? Our projector's on strike. What's going on? Some of you are from India and you know where Orissa is. There we go. Orissa, it's okay, it's back. Orissa is on the eastern side of India, and it's one of the celebrated places in Orissa is Puri, where the Jagannath Rath Yatra takes place in Puri. Just north of Puri is Bhubaneswar. Bhubaneswar is a big city in Orissa. And not far from Puri is Alanath or Amaranath. So they describe Lord Shiva speaking Bhagavatam to Parvati. We find another example within Srimad Bhagavatam itself. Lord Sankarshan speaks the Bhagavatam to the four Kumaras. For those of you that are new, all these names are maybe confusing, but you get the idea. It's a very popular book. The four Kumaras, they then explained the same to Sankyayana Muni. Sankyayana Muni explained the same to Parashara Muni and Brahaspati. Brahaspati is the chief priest of the demigods. And there's two references, Skanda Purana and the Bhagavatam. And Brahaspati, the chief priest of the demigods, explained it to Uddhava. Remember Uddhava? So Uddhava's spiritual master was Brahaspati. Interesting. And that's well understood. Uddhava was a devotee of Krishna, but his spiritual master was Brahaspati. So he's very learned. Brihaspati is very, 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 very vastly learned, and so was Uddhava, his student and disciple. So he not only narrated to Brihaspati, he also narrated it to Parashara Muni. Parashara Muni was the father of Vyasadeva. Vyasadeva wrote the Bhagavatam. Parashara Muni spoke the Bhagavatam to Maitreya. And Maitreya then spoke this message to Vidura. You get the idea? It's a popular... And, they didn't change things. They just repeated it, transmitted it transparently. And that's the last slide. So this is something about the importance of the Srimad-Bhagavatam. So stepping back and get the big picture, there's this vast body of, we can say, knowledge or wisdom, literature, written in Sanskrit. Before it was written in Sanskrit, it was present in sound. Before it was present in sound, is eternally existing as sound. Creation comes into being in cyclical fashion, and then rishis receive that sound and vibrate that sound. In course of time, the age changes and people become weaker in memory, so things are written down. So now it's in a written form, but it's still meant to be vibrated. And so when you read Srimad-Bhagavatam, it's nice to read it aloud. I mean, you don't have to, but it's nice to read it aloud. It's meant to be sung and heard, and even ideally heard in the company of like-minded persons who also wish to understand what's the source of everything, how does everything connect with that source, how do we act in our relationship with that source, and what's the mature fruit of acting in that relationship with that source. And that's what's in the Vedas, and that's what's in the Bhagavatam, the ripened fruit of that. And since it's ripened, it's very juicy, very sweet. It's described like that in the Bhagavatam itself. Pibata Bhagavatam rasam alayam. Rasa. It has nice taste, transcendental taste. And my subject, I was asked this question. We got on the elevator. These beads, I've been chanting on these beads same beads for 52 years. And I've been reading Bhagavatam for about the same amount of time. And I can say, specific to the Bhagavatam, that it's life-changing. It doesn't change the world outside, but it changes how you experience inside. It's a consciousness transforming, and it helps one see things differently and feel things differently and experience the world and people and stuff differently. So it's a very powerful literature, very potent, cleansing, illuminating, and very soothing. Prabhupada explains like this. When this verse that says, after Krishna's departure, where will virtue and higher consciousness take shelter for people in general? The answer is the Bhagavatam. So the comparison is a metaphor, but after the setting of the sun, the moon may rise. But when the sun is present, it gives lots of light, but it's sometimes scorching hot. No, in the wintertime it's not so scorching hot, but it can be scorching hot sometimes. But if the moon gives as much illumination as the sun, but the rays are soothing, like the rays of the moon are very soothing, the Bhagavatam is like that. It gives the light of the sun, but soothing, cooling rays. When Krishna appeared, there are, according to Bhagavad Gita, three main purposes of his appearance. One was to give protection to the devotees, and the other was to admonish the miscreants, So he had weapons. He had a club and he had a disc, and people were terrorizing the universe. They were dealt with, and it was hot. The Bhagavatam works in a different way. If there's ill tendency or demonic tendency, it has the potency to revert the ill tendency to elevated tendency. It has that potency or potential. So even if one is unqualified, just like that first little section that we read, even if somebody is not inclined, they're immersed in the material energy, they can become released from the material energy just by this light of the Bhagavatam. And it's very soothing, very pleasing, very elevating. Even if you don't understand something, that's okay. The sound vibration has that potency. And gradually, as the coverings of illusion are reduced and the higher consciousness is refined and awakened, you can start to understand things that you couldn't understand before. In transcendence. It's that kind of literature. There isn't another literature quite like it. So that's the importance. And I'm happy that you have Srimad-Bhagavatam now in your home. I'm sure you'll read it eagerly and have lots of questions and discuss those questions with those that have some experience. If they don't have answers, they'll find the answers and help you. So just keep a nice journey of a lifetime. The goal of life is now on your table here. The means to reach the goal. Let's see if there's some discussion. Yes. It'll probably help if you turn the button on. Okay, keep speaking. He's going to adjust the dials over here.
So, Parikshit Maharaj listened Bhagavatam 2 times, one from Sukadeva Goswami and one from Uddhava.
He heard from Shukadeva Goswami for sure. Now, Uddhava narrated for the benefit of the queens, and he was there with the queens. He was there to protect the queens. So it sounds like he heard it a second time. It's not mainly the person who's hearing, it's the queens are the main people who are hearing. But, I mean, you can hear it twice, that's fine. I understand. Yeah. Nice.
So,
You listen very carefully, that's good.
First he heard from Uddhava and then...
No, first he heard from Shukadev.
But that was for only 7 days and after that he left the body.
Ah, good point. So that was the last he heard. Good point. Very good. Now, here's a detail. You like details, right? There are different days of Brahma, and each day of Brahma, Krishna appears. And each day of Brahma, when Krishna appears, the events that occur during Krishna's lifetime vary slightly. Just like Lord Ramachandra also appears once in a day of Brahma. So there are different versions of Ramayana, and thus there's also different versions of Krishna's life, which is Srimad-Bhagavatam. So it may be, and I don't have the answer to is it this or that? It may be that this is a different day of Brahma. But it's the same Bhagavatam, at least in essence. You with me? Okay. You're a good listener. That's nice. Anything else? As long as there's silence, I'll give another example. You're responsive to your point. Go ahead.
So is there any scientific proof or any benefit from hearing or reading the scripture?
Aside from subjective, you want to know, is there scientific?
Yeah, I understand. It's slow and it purifies the soul, and it's a lifelong learning. But other than that,
Well, yes, not specific to the Srimad-Bhagavatam, but
Right.
specific to Vedic sounds. There's 2 scientific experiments that I'm aware of. There's probably more. One is a scientist from the early 1900s. He experimented very, very meticulously, kept very careful records, and of the influence of sound on matter. And he, statistically measured things. So one of the things he found was that ordinary sound, non-Vedic sound, has a different effect on matter than spiritual sound, like pranava, like Om. For example, I saw a video of it. That the instrument that he created in his laboratory, he called a tonoscope, and it has 3 parts. One part generates a sound. The second part channels the sound towards some medium, and then the third is the medium. And then the medium would sometimes be crystal, sometimes it would be a membrane, different mediums. And on the membrane or the crystal, there was powder or some gross physical material elements, and to see how it would affect the elements. So I watched a video, and when the sound generator was generating the sound Om, the membrane started to vibrate, and the powder started to move in such a way that the symbol Om was formed on the membrane. And then he changed the sound to some ordinary sound. It became chaos. Not instantly, but it's bounced around and bounced around. And I didn't see a video of the same, but the article that I read, the Vedic alphabet, Sanskrit alphabet, would also be formed. When that sound was generated, it would form that, the Devanagari script of that sound, or that syllable, dhatu. And so Vedic sound affects matter, and material sound doesn't affect matter in the same way. It doesn't configure itself accordingly. There's another scientific study that I'm aware of, and this was a Swedish man, no, a Swiss man, had interest in the effect of sound on memory and the mind. So he played with it a little bit during his professional career, and then after his professional career, he just focused on the effect of sound effect of Vedic sounds on the mind and memory. And he found, there's data, but the findings were memory increased 3 or 4-fold for persons who regularly chanted Vedic mantras. And there's some other benefits, clarity of thought and things like that. But memory was a big one. That Vedic sound had an effect. And he did it, in the West, and he went to India and studied the people that are accustomed to Vedic mantras for, a couple of hours a day or something like that. And their memory capacity was vastly greater. And some of that didn't and then started to do it. Their memory increased. So those are two experiments that I'm aware of. Now, it's not specific the benefit of Srimad-Bhagavatam, but it's the benefit of, or the effect of Sanskrit sounds being vibrated on, human beings. Neurological system is impacted. Oh, that's another one. A third one is neurology changes. The hardware changes. Studies from Harvard Medical School. Hardware changes. Your whole neurological system in the brain changes. And I don't know exactly how they studied that, but that's the conclusion.
Thank you.
Okay.
Did he have any specific mantras that he played around with?
Not that I'm aware of. My guess is they probably, but I'm not aware of, this versus another. I am aware of a study that was done at the University of Central Florida, maybe 20 years ago. A person I know did his PhD on the effects of mantra on depression, the modes of nature, and I forget the third. So he made a proposal, it was passed through his department. The statistics department examined his methodology, etc., etc. Fast forward, how he got people to participate, not because they were believers, but two things. He offered them $30 if they would do the experiment, and that's not a lot of money, but it's something. And that they were interviewed on the basis that they would actually do it and report accurately. So minus the system that was looked at by different department heads, he found there were three groups. One group that had a standard Vedic mantra, another group that had the Hare Krishna mantra, and another group that was the placebo group. Gobbledygook syllables, and they said the same thing to each group. What they said to each group is, this is a very ancient mantra, and by speaking it, it will help you in these three areas. But so the requirement is, you recite this mantra in the morning for X amount of time every day for the next 3 months or whatever it was. And then they were interviewed in intervals during that period of time by 3 sets of people without the details. And the findings was the Hare Krishna mantra surpassed the subjective report of all three, in all three categories. Minimizing tendency for depression compared to an actual Vedic mantra and gobbledygook syllables. And another was the modes of nature, and that was very subjective, but was designed to determine that. And I forget what the third one was. I think it's something to do with happiness, but in any case. And then the person who wrote his PhD thesis said there's much scope for further study, and he suggested some further studies. He didn't personally do it. And there may have been others that I'm not aware of. My guess is somebody did it somewhere. Yeah. Online? Okay.
Marriage, this question is from Carlos Ernesto Carmego Prabhu, and he's asking, Maharaj, for some or many, the Uddhava Gita is considered the 13th canto. Why is it not included as part of the Srimad-Bhagavatam body then?
It is. Uddhava Gita is 11th canto, chapters, I forget, chapters 10 through 26 or something like that. It's not 13th canto, it's within the 11th canto. So I don't know any reference that says this other.
The next question is from Rajeshwari Pranmataji,
Okay.
and she's asking, why is Srimad Bhagavatam called natural commentary of the Vedanta Sutra if Vedanta means conclusive knowledge? So why is it the natural commentary?
For our newer people, let me just give a little background. You saw the slide, and I spoke it also. Vyasadeva took this vast body of sound vibration, oral tradition knowledge, knowing that this age of Kali was coming and people would have weaker memories, so he put it in a written form for people this age, because they can have to read it again and again to understand what to speak of, remember it. So when it was put in the written form, he summarized the essence of all the Vedas, these different parts of the Vedas, in little codes or aphorisms or sutras, real terse statements that are puzzling. But within, it's like, puzzle coded, and then within those little codes, that's everything. That's Vedanta Sutra. And then he wrote Srimad-Bhagavatam to explain Vedanta Sutra. Compiled all the Vedas, pressed it down into little codes, and then explained the codes. And Srimad-Bhagavatam is that explanation. It's the commentary by the author. The Vedas, what Vyasadeva was the author of was Vedanta Sutra. And Vedanta Sutra is his composition. The rest of it was just written down. What was already existing, just written down. So his explanation, his summarization, summary, saying it again, is the little codes, sutras. And then he explained it, or it's his commentary on Vedanta Sutra. That's why it's called the commentary on Vedanta Sutra, because it's a commentary on Vedanta Sutra.
She has another question
Okay.
also. We hear Srimad Bhagavatam from our spiritual masters. We read it with devotees, and we also self-read. How do we not deviate from the real purpose of reading? Love of Krishna and service attitude. Sometimes we tend to go towards knowing or gaining knowledge and complete reading.
Well, the essence of the question is, how do you overcome conditioning and return to pure consciousness? Because conditioning is, the information gathering and competition, and pure consciousness is neither of those. So it takes purification. Purification is a gradual process. The principle is you come in contact with that which is pure, you become pure. Pretty simple. You come in contact with that which is warm, you get warm. You come in contact with something that's wet, you get wet. You come in contact with something that's pure, you get purified. So it's a gradual process. Purification, to achieve what she's asking, you just continue. There's an operative principle, and that's sincerity. You actually want purity. You get purified even if you don't want it. But if you want it, it happens more quickly. The purification is more effective.
Lal Gopal Prabhu also has a question.
Okay.
Powder particles are non-sentient. How can then they respond to the sounds? Is that could be the living entities within each of the powder particles that are responding to the sounds?
Not necessarily that the particles are living entities responding to sound, but rather subtle affects gross. And spiritual is subtle, and matter is gross. And the configuration of matter is affected by the spiritual. And if the spiritual is pranava, it's not moving because, there's a living entity over there saying, please align yourself with my desire. It's just matter moves by the touch of spirit, or the subtle affects the configuration of gross. At least that's my understanding.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Okay. Over here? Yeah.
My question is on book distribution.
Okay.
We see that distribute Bhagavatam, and I was hoping you could clear my doubts on that, because I've always felt reserved about doing that.
Why?
Because here's a good example. Like today, as devotees, we understand that the Bhagavatam is the literary incarnation of the Lord, and so here we're gonna even have an installation program here, and just to be giving parts of Bhagavatam to people just out on the streets, I just felt always reserved about that. Like, it doesn't seem like the appropriate thing. Gita and Prabhupada's smaller books and things like that, for sure. But I don't know. It just doesn't feel. I guess you're getting where I'm coming at.
I got your question.
Yeah.
Well, a few years ago, I was a brahmachari, and one of my main services for a number of years was distributing Bhagavatams. And before that, it was distributing Krishna book, which is the 10th Canto. And I didn't have a problem with it because Prabhupada said, even if someone touches the book, they're benefited because it's pure. Now, if someone touches something pure and they're not yet pure, there's something that's pure doesn't become contaminated. Rather, that which is impure becomes purified by touch of that which is pure. It's a great benefit. Now, is there some risk? Well, there may be some risk that the person may defile the Bhagavatam or Bhagavad Gita for that matter. I mean, one of my reservations was, this is just personal sharing, our book distribution leader, Vaisheshika Prabhu, has been championing Bhagavad Gita's being placed in motels. Because Gideon's Bible is in motels, so why not Bhagavad Gita in motels? And so they have a whole program. People sponsor cases and cases and cases. And I was thinking, wait a minute. People that made no sacrifice at all, like when there's a book distribution effort, they're making some sacrifice. But there's the Bhagavad Gita in somebody's room, and they're, a rascal or an offensive person, and they take it out and defile it, or who knows what. So I was a little concerned. I had some reservations about it. But it turns out, after seeing what happens, there may be some of that goes on. I had the experience as a young brahmachari, 52 years ago, on the streets of Boston, and there was a madman. He took a Back to Godhead magazine, snatched it from the person's hand, threw it on the ground, and started jumping up and down on it. He was a madman. That same madman, by the end of the summer, had completely changed around and was encouraging people to take the magazine and was chanting Krishna's name just by contact with the Sankirtan party. He was still mad, but he was favorable mad instead of, offensive mad, because he became purified. So people that with this Motel Gita thing, I've heard there may be people that do defile the Bhagavad Gita. There's some of that. But many of the motel owners would say, well, people would come and ask me, can I keep this copy? I really liked it. Can I have some more? Substantial number of people, so they had to keep supplying the motel owners with more Gitas because people wanted to take home. Probably some people took it and didn't ask. Some people probably defiled it, and some people asked. But it had an impact. It had a purifying impact on everybody that even came in touch with it. Like, what's this, out of curiosity or something? So I don't have any reservation. We were distributing Srimad-Bhagavatam, the way it was going on during some stretch of time, it was, second canto part 2, third canto part 3, fourth canto part 4, and my question was, how people going to? They would ask, where are the other parts? And so Prabhupada was asked, what do you say when they ask that? Prabhupada's answer was very simple. He said, you can tell them, when you lick on an ice cream, whatever side you lick on the ice cream, it's sweet. So that's what I said, and people thought, okay. So that was my concern. Are they going to, where is this coming from? It's part of something bigger. What's this something bigger? We just, volume by volume, as they came out, we distributed them. We read them and distributed them. Right in the airport with, people that knew nothing about nothing. Someone else. Yeah.
What exactly does the Bhagavatam consist of? Because, for example, in the Quran that's on the table, that's like specific questions, right? And then Sut Goswami, or not Sut Goswami, Shukadev Goswami, I'm sorry, answers, right? So it's like that
Questions,
specific,
answers format, yeah.
Yeah, so that's that specific version of the Bhagavatam. So is there like an essence or an original Srimad-Bhagavatam, so to speak?
There's different ways of answering and keeping it simple, considering the audience here. There is an essence of the Bhagavatam, and those are 4 verses found in Canto 2, Chapter 9, verses 31 through 34. If I remember correctly, 31 to 34. 4 verses, that's the essence. After presenting the essence, Shukadev Goswami then presented the 18,000 verse version, which is expanding and explaining those 4 verses. But it's much more detail. And it's described in the heavenly realm, these 18,000 verses is some number, hundreds of thousands of verses, I forget the number. So there's, shrunk down to 4, 18,000, so many hundred thousands. It's the essence is the essence. So you wanted to know, is there an essence? It's those 4 verses. It's one way of describing. The essence of Srimad-Bhagavatam is packed up in those 4 verses. Is that what your question is? Not exactly.
I think it's because of you showed the slides, right, where different personalities are speaking the Srimad Bhagavatam to another personality.
Yes.
And so I was wondering, are there different versions? Or does it include all the pastimes that we currently have?
No. No. There's variety in topics, and there's variety in details. But the essence it is the resting place of all those varieties and details. And as mentioned, there's different days of Brahma, and in different days of Brahma, there's different appearances of Krishna, and different Bhagavatam's appearances are also variegated according to different days of Brahma. I was pausing at one point before our first question over here, before your question, and that was looking over here at our friend. In Sanatana Goswami's presentation, Brihat Bhagavatamrita, you saw that in the third or fourth slide. It's a summary of Uddhava speaking to his mother, what he heard and understood from what Maharaj Parikshit said. That's what Brihat Bhagavatamrita is. In that Brihat Bhagavatamrita, for example, there's a pastime of Krishna's subduing the Kaliya serpent. And it's a different description that we find in the Bhagavatam. And then there's a story in the Bhagavatam, Brihat Bhagavatamrita, of Krishna subduing Keshi. And instead of killing Keshi, he puts him in a corral, and from time to time the cowherd boys will go out horseback riding on the back of Keshi, which is different than what's in the Bhagavatam. And then there's other, and our commentators, our Vaishnava commentators describe with Kaliya. Kaliya volunteered to Krishna. It's not in the Bhagavatam, but in other Puranas. He volunteered to Krishna, if you ever wish, I can be your carrier. I can carry you as swiftly as Garuda carries you. And our commentators say there are some appearances of Krishna where instead of Akrura coming to take Krishna to Mathura, Kaliya takes Krishna to Mathura. And that's not in our Bhagavatam. It's another day of Brahma. But our acharyas are referring to it, which for us makes it, it's authoritative version. It's just not our Srimad-Bhagavatam. So there's variation on the theme of, but the themes remain essentially same. That's how Prabhupada explains. Variety is the mother of enjoyment. And so when Krishna performs his pastimes in different days of Brahma, there's variety, because he's enjoying this way, slightly different that way, but there's a theme. There's a rasa involved in the exchange of love with his devotees. So that's the same. And then there's variety. Okay, we're done. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Yeah.